Hi, I'm Ariel. You're watching She Wants the Diction, and today I'm going to be reviewing Drug Use for Grown-Ups by Dr. Carl Hart. This book is written by a psychologist and a neuroscientist, and he is also currently the professor of psychology at Columbia University. And it's a really interesting book because it's about essentially how drugs should be not only decriminalized, but basically legalized. And because it's written from the perspective of a Black scientist, he really goes deep into the reasons why drug legalization is actually a race issue as well, simply because there are so many people of color that are incarcerated for minor drug offenses, even though all races use drugs pretty evenly across the board. I really enjoy the narration. It's narrated by the author himself, and I really personally feel that Black men should just narrate everything ever. Like, I would live for that. I love it. I do think his narration was a little stilted at parts, but still, I really enjoyed it. Like, it was a very good audiobook. I liked the personal sort of memoirish feel that he brought to it. It's almost like nonfiction plus a little bit of like his personal life. And I think if you really enjoy like listening to oldies, you will appreciate some of the music that he includes to sort of enhance the storytelling. Now, full disclosure, I am somebody who already believes pretty firmly that drugs should be legalized, like all drugs, period. Just because humans have been altering their consciousness since the beginning of time, and also, you know, drugs being illegal, substances being illegal, has never stopped anybody who wants to use those substances. And so that's why I just think we should let people use what they want to use. And one of the arguments that's made in this book is that actually what kills people isn't drugs themselves, it's sort of a lack of knowledge about how to use them. For example, dirty needles, not knowing that certain drugs don't mix or shouldn't be mixed. You know, it's a lack of knowledge about how to use them and a lack of access to like clean supplies and things like that. He also sort of talks about the arbitrary categories that we place drugs into. Like meth and heroin, for example, are considered like hard drugs or bad drugs, when actually MDMA is very similar, but that's not seen as harmful. And I just thought that within this book, he made so many good and interesting points. You know, one of which was he pointed out that Bernie Sanders has had some pretty ignorant discourse about drugs and, you know, drug legalization, which as somebody who supported for and was going to vote for Bernie Sanders, I do appreciate that he pointed that out, because Bernie Sanders is definitely not perfect, you know, no politician is. And I also thought it was interesting that he pointed out that the term harm reduction is actually harmful. And I didn't know about the concept of harm reduction until I read, I believe it was Pleasure Activism by Adrienne Maree Brown, which is basically like we should let people use drugs, but we should try to minimize the amount of harm that comes from them using them. But he actually argues in this book that the term harm reduction is actually bad, because it implies that drugs are mostly harmful. And one of the things he also talks about is how in a lot of these studies, because they're being funded by the government or organizations that are paid for by the government, they will completely ignore any evidence that drugs are helpful and concentrate on the fact that on like the harmful effects, when any substance is going to have positive and negative effects, is kind of his argument. He also approaches it from the angle that because the Constitution, you know, says that we have the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, drugs should be considered a part of that and should be legalized and should be a human right, basically. Another thing I thought was great is that he kind of talks about how the only reason that things like marijuana are starting to be legalized is so that the government can make money off of them. One of the things that I find really frustrating is that there are so many, you know, Black and people of color, Latinos, etc., that are locked up for marijuana offenses. But now it's seen as the new thing, the trendy thing. And there's just so many now dispensaries and, you know, things that are finally making it acceptable to consume marijuana. You know, even calling it cannabis instead of weed or whatever, I feel like it's just like trying to raise like the bar almost. Like now it's seen as like an acceptable thing. But there are so many people of color who are still in prison, locked up for these ridiculous offenses. And so we're seeing the tide turning where now the government is realizing they can make tons of money off of it. I mean, look at Colorado, for example. And so that's the only reason that it's starting to become acceptable, at least marijuana use. And I thought that was a really good point. To bring back up Adrienne Maree Brown's book, there's a really excellent essay in this that talks about how now these dispensaries are making money off of marijuana, but the people that have been supplying, you know, Black people that have been supplying this service to their community are kind of being like pushed out. And now the majority of profits are being made by white people who have turned it acceptable instead of the people who were, you know, working at the ground level. And it sort of talks about how we should be taking these people who are criminalized for drug offenses and, you know, training them to work in like dispensaries and things like that, instead of punishing them for it. I did give this book 4 stars. And the reason for that is that I thought it was really good, but not perfect. And if I was to rate it on yay, nay, or meh, I would definitely say, yay, you should read this book. One of my only complaints about this book is that I do think he tended to sort of ramble and repeat himself sometimes, but overall I really, really liked it. One of the things that really shocked me is that he admitted to being a heroin user in this. And, you know, heroin is kind of one of those drugs that's seen as the bad drugs or the hard drugs, but he kind of talks about how most people who use heroin don't actually inject it. And that's the main thing for me is like, you know, I believe everything should be legalized. You know, people should be free to do whatever they want to do. But my thing is when you're putting other people in danger, and I feel like this a lot of times comes with needles. Like, for example, I work in a hotel and occasionally there will be needles found that could potentially poke people. You know, you can get HIV and all kinds of other things from being, you know, poked with a needle. It happened to somebody that I worked with when I worked at the gas station. They got poked by a needle that was in the trash. So I feel like at that point, you know, you're being irresponsible because you're not disposing of your needles correctly. And so that's one of the reasons that I feel like I've kind of like been hesitant to be like, yeah, heroin, as opposed to like, you know, psilocybin and marijuana and things like that are seen as the softer drugs. I also just don't think it's fair that, you know, alcohol, you know, technically kills millions of people every year and like drunk car crashes, things like that, but it's perfectly legal, but marijuana isn't, you know what I mean? I just don't really see that as fair. I see that as like a societal bias. But he explains that there are multiple ways to consume it, there are ways to consume it safely, and he kind of says that coming out of the closet, so to speak, as a drug user, especially these people that are in high, you know, respected positions like him because he's a professor, or, you know, working professionals that are able to do their job perfectly well, if everybody came out and admitted their drug usage, he says that it might bring about a shift in society where people stop seeing it as something that makes you irresponsible, a loser, you know, not able to contribute to society. He also talks about how it's not really profitable to depict drugs as like this thing that normal people can use and, you know, go about their lives, because all we ever see are these like dramatized addiction stories and people ODing, which again is usually the result of them, you know, mixing different drugs, being cross-faded. He also talks about how deaths from multiple drugs can be counted more than once. So if you had more than one drug in your system and there was a single person that died, they could be counted multiple times as like multiple drug deaths under different categories. And so I just thought that was fascinating. Like that's stuff that the common person, you know, me, for example, would not just know. But because he's been studying, you know, drug use for so long, these are things that he's noticed that sort of bias society against legalizing drugs. So I thought this was a great book. I think it's definitely worth your time to check out, especially if you have an interest in anything to do with, you know, drugs, legalization, etc. I think we really need to break the stigma around using drugs in our society, because if everybody was more educated and things were able to be accessed safely, I think it would be a safer society, as opposed to penalizing people for something that humans have been doing, you know, since time immemorial. So that's my review. Let me know what you guys think down in the comments. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you guys in my next video. Peace.